Our next speaker, James Bryant, is a master in his field. He is an architect, formerly with the University of Colorado and the College of Environmental Design. His subject brings home to us the importance in everyday life of art. We all live in houses. We work in buildings. These are expressions of a key area of art. Sometimes very bad art, especially in our day, but a necessary form of art. His concern, therefore, is of a special relevance to us, because since art manifests our perspectives on life, if we show a lack of order, a lack of a sense of true design in this field, we reveal the bankruptcy of our culture. Thus, it is especially important for us to consider what James Bryant, a master architect, has to say to us.
Thank you, Dr. Rushdoony. Some years ago, I became acutely aware of the fact that I did not know the truth about anything. I was a perfect product of our culture, since we have been taught the truth is unknowable, or at best, it's only relative. In John, the 18th chapter, verses 37 and 38, with Jesus standing before Pilate, Jesus said that he came to bear witness to the truth. Pontius Pilate responded with a question, more of a comment really, not expecting that there was an answer. "What is truth?" he said. Suddenly I realized that I couldn't say I knew for certain the truth about anything. I didn't even know the definition of the word. After delving into some Hebrew and Greek source books, I came up with a working definition based upon the biblical use of the word. Truth, that which is stable and unchanging, or that which results or brings stability and equilibrium. God proclaims himself throughout the Bible as the God of mercy and truth, the God of loving kindness, and that which is stable and unchanging. Then I followed the word in all of its variations through the entire Bible. The first place the word truth is used is when Abraham's servant is sent to fetch a wife for Isaac. And we all know the scenario where Rebekah comes up to the well and the scene unfolds in such a way that it confirms that the servant is indeed in the right place. He pauses and he says something like the following. He says, "I give thanks to the God of my master Abraham, the God of mercy and truth." And in my own paraphrase, what follows next is, "And it's no accident that I'm in the right place at the right time, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing." If we conform to the truth in any aspect of life, it brings stability and equilibrium. One of my favorite psalms that I remember as a youngster growing up and was in the church ritual every Sunday was Psalms 96. For he comes to judge the world and the peoples with his truth." I've come to understand that not so much as God in a black robe with a gavel going to make a pronouncement of guilty or not guilty. Truth is more like a template. You remember the multiple choice tests we all took in school, and you filled in the blanks, and the teacher laid a sheet on top of that, and there were holes in there, and if you lined up with the hole, you got the answer right. It is a standard against which we can evaluate our own behavior, a standard for every aspect of life and conduct. It's a process of holding up the template and did you conform or did you not? In 1 Timothy 2:4, it says, God would have all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So not only would God have us come to the truth, but it is knowable. Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He also said about Satan that the truth is not in him. That led me to asking a curious question about many things around me. What is the truth about this situation? What is the truth about the profession that I've spent the time that I have, at that point, the 20 years of investment? With that in mind, I'm going to tell you the truth about architecture. There is a standard, there is an absolute, a template to which we may refer and use as a tool. Now, I don't have an exclusive corner on the truth, but we all have access to it, and I think it's time that it was communicated. First, we'll discuss the situation in architecture and how we got where we are. Second, we will discuss the truth, that which is stable and unchanging, God's order for creation and how it applies to architecture and to design. Today, architecture is philosophically and ideologically bankrupt, if not altogether dead. What is passed as modern or international style has been deeply rooted in the humanistic socialism of post-World War I Germany and France, with roots stretching back much further to the so-called Enlightenment. Man and what he makes of natural materials has been glorified. Architecture and city planning were supposed to solve our social problems, house and office the masses, and rebuild a better world. The organizing principles are man's reason, applied in a relativistic context of whatever seems appropriate. There is no recognition of the basic principles of an orderly, creative God. The classical Greeks, even as humanists, perceived and acknowledged the organizing principles of the created world in their system of line and proportion for designing buildings and planning building complexes. This recognition has influenced the design and structures of buildings right up to the threshold of modern architecture. Along with the historic styles, modern architecture threw out those principles and proceeded to build on the philosophical sand of humanistic philosophy and ideology. The overeducated elite has now declared modern architecture dead and proclaimed the advent of postmodern architecture. This presumably leaves the profession free to do anything, a reaction against the cold rationalism of the short-lived modern era. Now we're beginning to see some of the worst conglomerations of building materials masquerading as architecture, backed up by some of the most convoluted, circuitous reasonings and explanations. It's part of the current expression of freedom, freedom without limits, the do-your-own-thing mentality, and ranges anywhere from paste-on, mixed classical motifs to brand-new buildings designed to look like the wrecker's ball or an earthquake had just hit. This kind of disintegration has been happening for years in painting, music, and sculpture. It's indicative of a disintegrating society. The architecture journals glorify more conspicuous examples of it by sponsoring awards and publishing them. I'm sorry to say the American Institute of Architects Honor Awards program recognizes and praises them as well. One architect, Michael Graves, of a recently completed example in the Northwest, the Portland City Hall, stated that he hopes people will recognize the building for the humanist statement that it is. I do. I also see it as an expression of where our society is going, and I don't want to go along. Architecture schools continue to crank out an elite class of designers, environmentalists, and technicians steeped in social determinism and irrelevant to about 90% of actual construction. A master's degree graduate with a newly acquired license falls far short of the mark set historically. The architect once was the master builder as well as a master designer. Personally, I have abandoned the contemporary job description of the architect to design and build as architect general contractor. This after many years of trying to fit the mold outlined by schools and fellow architects. I now have a different vision and perspective of what an architect can and should do. God created an orderly universe, and this order can be perceived. It can be the basis for organizing and giving form to that which we create, whether it be painting, music, sculpture, or architecture. Man, created in God's image and reborn of the Spirit, can be a co-creator, bringing order, balance, harmony, and integration to the world around him. In approaching the subject of God's created order, some historical background is necessary to understand how we got where we are today. Culturally, we have departed from the standard of truth in all aspects and dimensions of life. Architecture is another expression of this departure. The Bible gives us the truth about life and conduct, tells us the truth about God, and tells us that we can know true things about God. Romans 1:20 tells us, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made." God has given us the key to understanding his world in the Bible and in the things that he created. We are told that there are absolutes and that there are limits in the Bible, and we perceive those absolutes and limits in the created world. Scientists once thought that we can know about God by studying what he created, and that his creation is for all people to enjoy. Humanism, on the other hand, has no way to provide absolutes, and indeed denies the existence of absolutes. The existential philosophers claim truth is in one's own head, or like beauty, it is in the eye of the beholder. So all the standards go out the window. As Francis Schaeffer has pointed out, the philosophers from Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Kierkegaard onward, having lost their hope of a unity of knowledge and a unity of life, presented a fragmented concept of reality. Then the artist painted it that way. The philosophers first formulated intellectually what the artist later depicted artistically. Rousseau advocated absolute freedom from authority, from constraint, and from culture. The Age of Enlightenment and rationalism frowned upon any notion that there was an inherent order, harmony, proportion, and correspondence between things like music, architecture, or the human body. Rudolf Wittauer, in his book, The Architectural Principles in an Age of Humanism, states that Hogarth considered it a strange notion that there should be any correspondence between beauty, as seen by the eye, and harmony as heard by the ear. David Hume made the point that beauty is in the eye of the beholder and is entirely subjective. Edmund Burke said that no two things can have less resemblance or analogy than a man, a house, or a temple. By the end of the 19th century, John Ruskin asserted that proportions are infinite as possible heirs of music, and it must be left to the inspiration of the artist to invent beautiful proportions. Extending this heritage further with a theory of evolution, determinism, behaviorism, and so on, we are led to the conclusion that all we think or do is only with an illusion of freedom or choice, and that we are all programmed. Indeed, everything is relegated to the machine. As the architect Le Corbusier stated, a house is a machine for living. With this comes an increase in authoritarianism, in education and in government, in that only one point of view is tolerated. One result is the quality of art and architecture goes down. Anyone having to deal with a government agency, be it schooling or building department, has the experience of what Francis Schaeffer calls the technocracy, where the determining influence belongs to the technicians of the administration and the economy. The daily pattern of the ordinary man's life becomes a matter of control by the technocratic elite. They are the only ones who know how to run the complicated machinery of society, and they will then, in collusion with the government elite, have all the power necessary to manage it. This is true of planning commissions, design review boards, environmental review officials, all with no fixed point of reference for making a decision. With man alone, there is no way to arrive at a lasting consensus as to what is valid. It's all a matter of opinion, and what is good design becomes a matter of opinion with the power of government and media backing it up. Louis Sullivan, who practiced architecture in Chicago at the turn of the century, stated that at no time and in no instance has architecture been other than an index of the flow of the thought of the people. For as a people thinks concerning architecture, so it thinks concerning everything else. With that in mind, let us consider the comments of John Saunders from a symposium on Christian Reconstruction. Without content, the only element left for the humanist is the form of art and its manipulation. Humanistic thought depends for its propagation on the circumvention of clear rational thought by manipulation. In the case of drama, it's manipulation of the emotions. In the case of architecture, it's manipulation of form, usually somebody else's, either historical or contemporary. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, we see a curious paradox. While it appears logical to the humanist, it's typical in contradiction. There was a movement in all the arts to throw off the stifling rules of the past, and at the same time a tremendous pressure to conform to the so-called liberated thinking and expression that was emerging. The only problem was the new rules kept changing and seemed to be the exclusive property of several groups of self-proclaimed elites. Tom Wolfe has given an excellent, if biting, commentary on modern architecture in his book, From Bauhaus to Our House. Generally speaking, architects dislike the book. Personally, I think the reason is because Wolfe is quite accurate in his analysis. The emperor and his retinue were no doubt extremely angry when finally confronted with the fact that there were no clothes. According to Wolff, this elite mentality first emerged with the Vienna secessionist movement in 1897, where a group of artists and architects formally withdrew from the official Austrian cultural organization, and the attitude that prevailed was, we have the exclusive possession of the true vision of the future of art and architecture. Subsequent to this event came the emergence of various movements, the Cubists, the Fauvists, the Futurists, and the Bauhaus. This produced a sort of avant-gardism that makes up so much of 20th century art and architecture. Also at this time came the concept that by altering a society's architecture we can alter its whole character and outlook. The architect, city planner, artist, and intellectual was to remake the world, or to put it in the terms of the fundamental expression of the fall, to remake the world in your own image. Without the guiding principles and the truth of a loving God, that's all we are left with, each one of us, to recreate or remake the world around us in our own image. Later in 1919 came the Manifesto of the November Group, as Tom Wolfe quotes it. Painters, architects, and sculptors, you whom the bourgeoisie pays with high regard for your work out of vanity, snobbery, and boredom, hear. To this money there clings the sweat and blood and nervous energy of thousands of poor, hounded human beings. Hear. This is an unclean profit. We must be true socialists. We must kindle the highest socialist virtue, the brotherhood of man. Walter Gropius was the chairman of the November Group Working Council for the Arts and proceeded onward as the founder of the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was to be a complete integration of all the arts and technology and a rejection of all historical styles and references. It was to be an architecture and art for the masses. One thing, however, was left out. Nobody consulted the masses. But of course, that isn't necessary. They don't know what they need anyway. From the Bauhaus and other avant-garde movements such as De Stijl in Holland, Purism in France, we have received the flat roof, facade and interior devoid of ornamentation and decoration, the color scheme reduced to black, white, gray, and beige, expressing structure, standing in stark contrast to its context and environment, seemingly in an act of rebellion against the heretofore man-made and God-created world. All of this burst upon the waiting elite in the United States in 1932 at a Museum of Modern Art exhibit introducing Walter Gropius and his colleagues. In the introduction to the catalog, Philip Johnson used the title The International Style, and modern architecture has become synonymous with the international style. In 1937, Gropius arrived permanently in the United States along with Joseph Alberts, Marcel Breuer, Moholy-Nagy, Herbert Bayer, Mies van der Rohe. All were from the Bauhaus, all assumed leading positions at institutions in this country. Gropius was made the dean of the architecture department of the leading humanistic divinity school in the country, Harvard University. Moholy-Nagy went on to the Chicago Institute of Design. Mies van der Rohe became the dean of the Illinois Institute of Technology, and with only 17 or so completed buildings to his record, received a commission for 21 major buildings at the Institute. Joseph Albers went to Black Mountain College in North Carolina and later to Yale. Many others followed. In 1938, Arnold Schoenberg arrived with his version of music. With these people in key positions and welcomed with open arms by the establishment, the course of architecture was radically altered. The system of instruction and its humanistic base changed first thinking of the profession, and then the buildings came as an expression of that thinking. The fundamentals of the international style were the only expression condoned and indeed the only one tolerated. Any indigenous expression, from the shingle style to Frank Lloyd Wright, along with the Beaux-Arts tradition, was thrown out. The next step, and fundamental to the whole process, was the removal from the thinking of students of any individual genius. Gropius stated that the fundamental pedagogical mistake of the Academy arose from its preoccupation with the idea of individual genius. As a result, the study of architecture became divorced from acquiring the technical skills of building, drawing, designing, and a knowledge of aesthetic alternatives, and became instead a process of training a social engineer with a socialistic worldview. I know because I encountered it headlong. The school, which I graduated from, USC in Los Angeles, was, when I began in 1959, staffed almost 100% with practicing architects. Now, these were men not only with a local reputation, but national and in some cases international reputations. The school was set up to teach the basic skills necessary to become an architect in a somewhat classical sense. Not that they would reproduce classical buildings, but teaching the fundamentals of building and architecture, somewhat of a holdover from the old tradition, as the gospel, according to Gropius, had not quite penetrated the hinterlands yet. All that was to change in my third year when a Harvard master's graduate took over. Along with him came Mies van der Rohe, associate dean from IIT, and a host of other true believers. The first wave hit at the beginning of my fourth year. One of the hallmarks of the new bunch was an unbelievable arrogance towards anyone who did not conform to their precepts. The leveling process had begun. Group projects became the order of the day. The associate dean was heard to remark that we have a basic vocabulary for architecture: steel, glass, marble. We build the same building in Anchorage that we build in Scottsdale. We heat one and we air condition the other. Any idea of individuality is that you can hang a Picasso in your room and I'll hang a Klee in mine. That was it. Fortunately, they tolerated the upperclassmen and allowed us to proceed under the old program. The new faculty was astonished when some of us were given the opportunity and refused to spend our final semester studying with their latest imported evangelist, Conrad Boxman. It appeared to us that all we would be were research assistants for Professor Boxman's latest project, and we would learn little or nothing about design or architecture. This was indeed the case, as it turned out. Within 3 years, the faculty was stripped of practicing architects and given over to the newer crop of theoreticians who had never practiced and never would practice. I remember going to lunch with one of my professors in my fourth year, and I saw what was happening, and I asked him a series of questions. What is going to happen to the graduates of this school when they've completed your program? They'll go into an office asking for a job, and the interviewing architect will ask to see their construction drawings, what they know about producing a building, and he'll have to say, well, we don't have any professional practice courses. We don't learn how to do construction documents. The next question will be, well, let me see some of your design drawings. And when the student unrolls full-scale details of Crown Hall at IIT, the next question, having learned nothing about design, will be, well, may I see some of your drawings, renderings, perspectives, and so on. And the student will have to answer, well, we don't learn drawing anymore. And I asked the professor, what's going to happen to these students? And his response was, well, the profession is just going to have to change their attitude towards education. A little later, I noticed a curious paradox regarding this group of fanatics. Very few of them subjected themselves to their own architecture. Mies van der Rohe lived in the overstuffed Victorian Pearson Hotel in Chicago, 2 blocks from his famous Lakeshore Tower apartment complex. The associate dean at USC lived in the Spanish Colonial and was a connoisseur of and an expert on the architecture of Louis Sullivan, who was leagues apart from the Bauhaus mentality. The chief designer for another architect, Craig Elwood, at the time I was in school, lived in an apartment complex designed by John Lautner, who spent 7 years with Frank Lloyd Wright. Elwood himself inhabited a Spanish Colonial in Bel Air. Later, when I was teaching at the University of Colorado in the late 60s, the next wave hit, mostly out of Berkeley. These people were so heavily research-oriented, they didn't know what drawing was all about. I saw seniors in design get A's in design for writing a paper about how concerned they were regarding problems of the environment, never producing a solution, never drawing a line. In 1960, Paul-Jacques Griot, in his book, What is Design?, comments that the international and interchangeable style of design was considered not so long ago as the final solution to design. It is only another style, and as such possesses the artificial and dictatorial character of all styles without having true style. It only brings to design the kind of solution a dictator government brings to society. The fundamental soundness of the program was being questioned even in its hour of glory. 12 years later, in 1972, the Pruitt-Ego housing project, which won an AIA award, was demolished just 20 years after its completion. A total social and architectural failure. 10 years after that, in 1982, the landmark an award-winning high-rise international style Lever House in New York City, built in 1952, was slated for the Wreckers Ball. It has now been preserved as an historical landmark. Peter Blake, who was a product of this system, an architectural critic, an architect practicing in the East Coast, grew up under this tutelage, accepted it, wrote about it in the middle 70s, had a change of heart, wrote an interesting book in which he took a look at it and said, it's time to take a turn. It's time to take a different direction. He said, it has been a truly fantastic period in the history of architecture in more ways than one. Protesting its faith and reason, the movement was in fact the most irrational since King Ludwig of Bavaria went mildly berserk. What we are now left with is a constant rehashing of dead modern forms, an anachronism if there ever was one. Richard Meyer of New York, one of the most skillful of these manipulators, was in Seattle this year and made some interesting remarks in a talk at the Seattle Art Museum. He said, his architecture is reduced to the treatment of meaningful forms, dehistoricized and not representational. As to the future of architecture, he said, I don't know where we're going. I'm optimistic about the future, but I don't know where we're going. He believes that there is no universal criteria for every situation. There can be individual criteria for each case, and what we are seeking is an immunity from values. Historically, buildings tell us what we have valued, what people of any given period have valued. We know that at the time of Solomon, a high premium was placed upon the relationship to God and what God had told us about living on the planet and how our relationship should be. The temple was the most important in the kingdom. The Greeks also, temples, public buildings were important. Those remain as monuments. In the Romans, it was the public buildings, their law courts, and their temples. In the Middle Ages, it was the cathedrals. In the Renaissance, the palazzos of the wealthy families and the churches. What we have now in this country, as you look around, we can see that we've enshrined in boxes the corporate expressions of the Federal Reserve System in every city of any size across the country. The next holiest shrine is that of the august representative of maritime law, the insurance company. And that's followed on down the line by various corporate headquarters. We've come to a literal, graphic, and three-dimensional realization of what H.R. Ruckmacher refers to as modern man trapped in a box of his own reasoning. To paraphrase Dr. Rushdoony, the modern architect seeks continually a new way of saying nothing. Or as Frank Lloyd Wright was reported to have said about seeing a Mies van der Rohe building, whose maximum was less is more, I have never seen more of less. The next evolution or proclamation of style has led us to postmodernism. Much of it has been characterized 20 years before its advent in a few comments by Paul-Jacques Driot. Decadent periods are periods of doubt, confusion, and revolt. They are notorious for their lavish use of expensive material and extensive polychromy, together with poor design. It is a sign of the bad taste and selfish vanity that it is associated with all decline in culture. Extreme freedom in design has brought in its wake the danger of laxity, confusion, and disorder. Originality at all cost can only be a disease of the personality, the complex of a frustrated mind which cannot indeed create original work. Postmodern architecture has a preoccupation with a manipulation of form, expensive material, polychromy, and a low quality of design, opting for sensory stimulation. It is accompanied by a profuse and obscure language of explanation and justification, as it has nothing else to stand on. Michael Graves, Robert Stern, and others seemingly produce caricatures and distortions of historical styles and allusions to them. Robert Venturi has mastered the art of glorifying mediocrity, and the Yale art historian and critic Vincent Scully has hailed him as the greatest architect of his generation. A group calling themselves Site specializes in buildings which look like the Wreckers Ball or an earthquake had partially dismantled them, and features such things as several automobiles half submerged in the parking lot and then paved over with asphalt. Pietro Beluschi from the International Style Camp accuses the postmoderns of demolishing the hated glass box and substituting instead an enlarged jukebox. Mr. Graves' opinion is that architecture is an invention of man, like ritual, literature, and drama, establishing both a pragmatic and symbolic language. He's fond of using words like mythic, subliminal, anthropomorphic to describe the architectural culture his buildings express. Most is beyond the ordinary person. I've seen a change in what's being built for the majority of people. You can drive in most suburbs of any city. In the Northwest, for example, what used to be called the Northwest contemporary style is missing, has been for several years now. What's being built are farmhouses, Victorians, Tudors, French provincials. There is a desire on the part of people to be related to something that has stability. I think it's that innate desire that God has planted within all of us to seek the truth. And we see this trend. I think at this point we are in an era where people are looking for something, they're looking for the truth, while at the same time they're being told it doesn't exist. Dr. Rushdoony summed it up well, and I'll paraphrase again, that architecture has lost its hold on the masses and has become an esoteric cult of the self-elected elite and results only in fadistic mannerisms. The question is, where do we go from here? In Genesis, the account of creation tells us something of the limits that God has set within his creation. In the book of Job, chapter 38, is God's answer to Job. It's a magnificent and eloquent expression of God's creation and some of the limits he set. The opening words of chapter 38 might be directed to the whole humanist modern movement. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Counsel has been indeed darkened in the whole realm in which I operate by words without knowledge. It's time for an expression of the truth. It's time to begin to set some limits and call for some standards to be observed. God set limits on the sea, on light and darkness, on the stars, and in all creation. Romans 1:20 tells us that we can know of him in all that he created. Martin Selbrede stated, "There is only one alternative. God must be the starting point, the first given. From this principle, we move to the set of givens that God has established. For now we can recognize that there is an existing reality to which we must be conformed. For us to explore as dominion man in terms of God's revealed will. In the created world, the order is the order prescribed by God. This is how we can know which among the infinity of choices and alternatives which will create and result in harmony in their special designed relationships. The musician is confronted with the same quandary regarding which combinations of notes and intervals will make music and which ones will only make noise. Paul-Jacques Riot said that the work of the designer or artist is only as valuable as his ability to understand the laws of nature, the character of people and their needs, plus his own ideas and imagination. Basic to that is an understanding of the laws governing design, and that those laws are the fundamental principles of order and pervade all creation. Laws governing design, it's not some kind of legalism any more than gravity is some kind of legalism. We're talking about standards which bring stability and equilibrium. Observations of the ancients led them to the conclusion that there exists a universal order to which we are all related and upon which we depend. George Doxey, in his book The Power of Limits, presents an exhaustive study of creation and the underlying and unifying principles therein. Even William James, in his comment on the essence of true religion, with this statement, he said, "The belief that there is an unseen order and that our supreme good lies in harmoniously adjusting thereto." Now, what is the essence of that unseen order, and how do we begin to perceive it, and what does it have to do with architecture? The ancient architects of the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Celtic people, the Mexican pyramids, the Japanese, the Oriental architecture conform to the properties of a constant, the golden section, also known as the golden mean. This has not been taught for decades. We were told in school that there was a standard which the classical architects used, but it was no longer relevant. We didn't need to be limited by those kinds of standards and that kind of thinking. The power of the golden section to create harmony arises from its unique capacity to unite different parts of a whole so that each preserves its own identity and yet blends harmoniously into the greater pattern of a single whole. In some ways that sounds like God himself. I'll repeat that. The power of the golden section to create harmony arises from its unique capacity to unite different parts of a whole so that each preserves its own identity and yet blends harmoniously into the greater pattern of a single whole. This recognition filled the ancient Pythagoreans with awe. They sensed in it the secret power of a cosmic order. It also led to their endeavors to realize the harmonies of such proportions in the daily life. In classical architecture, all architecture was modular, and the particular module chosen was used through the building in plan elevation to modulate and proportion all the parts. According to the Euclideans, these ratios which were set up, these ratios, and a ratio refers to the quantitative comparison of two similar things. Proportion refers to the equality of ratios. Underlying any proportioning system is a characteristic ratio, a permanent quality that is transmitted from one ratio to another. Thus, a proportioning system establishes a constant set of visual relationships between the parts as well as between the parts and the whole. The golden section is fundamental to the historical system of proportion and order. The golden section is derived from a line that's divided so that the lesser portion is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. It may be written thus: A is to B as B is to A plus B. Its properties yield a constant known as phi, which is an irrational number like pi, having a value of 1.618. It is related to a series of numbers named for a Renaissance mathematician named Fibonacci. The series is such that any number in the series divided by the preceding one approximates 1.618, or the larger divided by the smaller yields 0.618. These are the characteristic proportional ratios between the minor and major parts of the golden section. The Fibonacci series is a harmonic progression, phi in one direction and 1 over phi in the other direction. The series begins 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, and 32, and so on. The sum of 1 is always made up of the two previous numbers. The number of the golden section, 1.618, is basic to all creation. It is the progression of this number by which the spiral of the chambered nautilus grows. It is the number of the series which reappear in the total number of spirals in a sunflower seed. According to Doxey's research, in patterns of organic growth, the irrational phi ratio of the golden section reveals that there is indeed an infinite and intangible side to creation. Every daisy and every sunflower is a window on the infinite, as are apple blossoms, the flowers of other trees, and bushes bearing edible fruit. These grow according to the pattern of the pentagon, and its extension, the pentagram or pentagonal star. The pentagram and the pentagon, like all patterns, are defined by their limits. Incorporated in the harmonious patterns of fruits and flowers, they exemplify an epigram attributed to Pythagoras that limit gives form to the limitless. In John 1:18, we read that no man has seen God at any time. God is limitless, but his creation has limits. We live within limits. We can know God and his truth because they're expressed within these limits for us to understand. The snowflake is an example. It's always a hexagon, yet there are infinite patterns in that one basic design. The pentagon is basic to organic forms. The hexagon appears in both organic and in inorganic forms. Griot has even speculated further and has calculated that the planets and their distance from each other in the sun are all in harmonic relationships of the golden section. Now, the Greeks didn't design buildings in the form of a pentagon, but they derived from it the basic triangles we use, or used to use: the sublime triangle, an isosceles triangle, the point of the pentagram, whose sides are in the phi ratio. From the interior of the pentagon, we get the triangle of Price, which is the only right triangle having its sides in geometric progression, 1, root phi, and phi. And the harmonic triangle, a right triangle whose hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the first three terms of the phi progression. the harmonic triangle was the drafting tool of the Middle Ages. It was their triangle. It was the triangle and the proportions they used to develop the volumetric space of the cathedrals, the spacing of the windows, the structural system, all the elements therein. And it followed through all of their art. This illustration from the Book of Kells follows the basic properties of the harmonic triangle. I was sitting out here looking at this, and I thought, I wonder if it does. And in the break, I got up and I measured it, and it does. We've lost the continuity of that. We've lost the ability to take everyday pieces of design and create a harmony. I was also looking at this podium. Somebody stuck some bric-a-brac on the front of it. It doesn't follow any particularly reasonable or rational order, but it would have been very simple to take this relationship and the height of it, the width of it, how far this overhangs, how the legs sit on the floor, and put it together in some harmonic relationships, like taking a little melody and relegating it to a major or a minor key in music. And then we have something that's pleasing to live with. But most people don't notice that because I think our educational system has inoculated us against the real thing. The other triangle commonly used and closely related to the harmonic triangle was the triangle of Pythagoras, the 3-4-5 right triangle. Without getting into a geometry lesson, suffice it to say that the golden section is basic to these constructions, and their extension has been used as a regulating or limiting device since antiquity. Phi, or the golden section, as a regulating ordering device has been mostly lost to us. Some vestiges still remain. We see extensions of this in today's paper sizes, which derive from the triangle of Price. This is an example of a 3x5 card still is part of that system of division. The standard canvas frame sizes used by painters belong to the harmonic triangle series. Martin Selbrede has pointed out that God has created an inherent order in music and has done so in such a way that man cannot puff himself up with pride about his musical theorizing. The word harmony comes from the Greek harmos, to join, and harmony is a relationship in which different and often contrasting elements complement each other by joining. Mostly we have an extension of these principles in our musical system. Two strings sound most pleasant together when they're equal in the ratio of 1 to 2, 2 to 3, or 3 to 4, or what we call unison, octave, dipent, or fifth, and ditesseron, or fourth. These follow the progression of the Fibonacci series, except for the 3 to 4, which is in proportion with the Pythagorean triangle. The octave has the 1/2 relationship, or 0.5, the proportion of a rectangle, composed of two equal squares having a diagonal of √5 in length, which is the joint length of two reciprocal golden rectangles. Further, it's interesting to note that there are on the piano 8 white keys and 5 black keys, with the black arranged in groups of 2s and 3s. We have a relationship of 2, 3, 5, and 8, the beginning of the Fibonacci series. Our Western music scales and chords are yet a further instance of the 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4 proportions of musical harmonies. The two chief modes of Western scales, the minor and the major, differ from each other only in the length of steps between certain of their intervals, just as major and minor parts of the golden section differ from each other only in their lengths. And just as the joining of minor and major scales called modulations enchant us when we hear them in the movement of chords and melodies. Everything in the minor and major scales has its own variants or degrees, so-called dominants and subdominants, with their own sets of chords, and the relationship of those to their tonic counterparts again follows the above proportions. Dominants started in on the 5th interval from the keynote, and subdominants started in on the 4th interval. Light, color, and sound also share the same wave patterns and also the same vibration rates. I wonder if Hogarth would change his mind if he knew this for certain. The experience of harmonious rhythms is shared by eye and ear, even though one registers in color and the other registers as sound. All shared proportional limitations approximate the 3 root harmonies of music. These recurrent patterns or rhythms are basic to the created order around us. These relationships were perceived by such masters as Albrecht Dürer and Leonardo da Vinci. Dürer's theories include the use of harmonic scales in relation to human proportion. Applying Pythagoras' theory of means to the ratios of intervals of the Greek musical scale, the Renaissance architects developed an unbroken progression of ratios that formed the basis for the proportions of their architecture. Leonardo said about good proportions that every part is disposed to unite with a whole, that it may thereby escape from its incompleteness. According to Leon Battista Alberti, beauty is the harmony and concord of all parts, achieved in such a manner that nothing could be added or taken away except for the worse. This recognition of the underlying order built around and generated by the value of phi, the golden section, was followed through the centuries in a continuous line by all the great builders, or until, as Griot says, the dark ages of the 19th century, when the line was suddenly broken, and the solutions gathered by centuries of science and art were thrown away by the rationalizations of the Enlightenment, choosing to ignore the truth of the created order of the world around them. Well, where has it survived? Well, I've mentioned canvas sizes, paper sizes. In the work of the 19th century architects such as H.H. Richardson, Louis Sullivan, and the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. These men were, Wright and Sullivan in particular, were students of botany, students of the created world around them. You look at the floor plans of Frank Lloyd Wright, and there are harmonic relationships in the grid patterns which he established. They carry through the three dimensions of the building, plan, section, and elevation. There's an order, there's a unity, there's a harmony there. Wright himself was fond of saying that architecture was frozen music. It survives by accident in the work of individuals working in the arts. It also is applied in things like the design of the 747 aircraft. In order to be successful working within the limitations of this created world, we are forced to conform to certain limitations. An analysis made by George Doxey of the 747 aircraft, we find that proportionally it fits within the limits of the golden section, not only in its wing design, but in the overall proportions of the aircraft, wingspan, length, and height. It'll have to, whatever we do that works in this world, that has to work against these imposed limitations, has to conform to those limits in order to be successful. Essential to good design is an obedience to the given order of God's creation and a keen sense of proportion. For some, this sense is a gift, but it lies latent within all of us as we are a product of that order. This sense can at least be developed to the level of appreciation in all of us. It must be understood that technical mastery of these principles is not necessarily enough to produce an art which mirrors the truth. Van Til said that man must will to develop his intellect in order to grasp more comprehensively the wealth of the manifestation of the glory of God in this world. The qualities of the artist include character, talent, mastery of technique, and understanding of the God-given functions of limits, and the ability not only to generate an idea, but to give it form. I think character is essential to it, because without character, a person will not develop the talent they've been given, they will not master the techniques necessary, and they will not be able to apply an understanding of the functions of limits. It's only then that we can truly achieve a freedom of expression with an astonishing variety. Now, I am not a Christian architect because I design religious buildings, but I'm a Christian architect because the work I do models the truth. And architecture can be created which expresses the truth, that which is stable and unchanging, that which brings stability to and equilibrium to the users of that building. If you don't think truth exists, or that it is an absolute, then you can't do it. You can't create a building, and you can't bring forth something which is stable and unchanging. There is an absolute or ultimate standard to which we may adhere. In architecture and the arts, they are not quite as prominent. These standards are just as fixed as the standards of aerodynamics used to design aircraft. Some of the laws have a shorter cause and effect relationship which become obvious rather quickly. We may ignore the laws of gravity and aerodynamics with rather sudden results. The consequences of ignoring the laws governing design have much more subtle and less noticeable effects. This brings us back to the basic reason and purpose for creating. Why do we do it, aside from some practical need that should be satisfied? I'll close with a quote from Dr. Rushdoony. Every artisan in the arts has the function of bringing forth a common self-realization under God. He externalizes, develops, and gives voice to the growth and awareness in his day of God's glory and grace as it is realized in and through man's world and experience. Thank you.